Okay, so it's 10 o'clock. I'll make a start. Welcome to Oktoberfest and my session on when SharePoint met Microsoft Teams. We will be covering in this session. We'll go quickly over through the SharePoint overview, a bit of history, and in terms of overview of the functionality side of things. And then we will look at with some demo examples of how SharePoint and Microsoft Teams mixes together, as well as managing Microsoft Teams in a securely way, the considerations that is to be made on that. So just before we go into it, a bit about myself. I'm Chirag Patel. I live and work in London, UK. I've worked with SharePoint for nearly 18 odd years since its first version of it. And generally, I tend to work with various clients and deliver sessions in community events such as these. I try and keep up with as much there is to learn, and from the ever-growing Office 365, the capabilities. And I usually visit this kind of events just purely to learn from other speakers, as well as being able to share my views, my experiences, what I come across. So hopefully in this session, you'll be able to take away those things as well. And mainly, I tend to work with the upgrades and migration side of things, as well as Teams. I've just recently got into Teams just over the last year or so, just over a year. But it's something that we all realize with every organization, something can't be ignored, or if it is switched on, then it's just not been deployed properly. So I've seen the mix of those two. And so hopefully I'll share some of those storylines around that as well. So a brief history around this. For those of you who's in SharePoint will be fully aware of in terms of where it's come from, in particular the messaging from Microsoft point of view as to collaboration has always been there right from the start in different varieties of different flavors. Of course, over the years, the industry has changed, new tools have come about, the way we develop software has changed. So SharePoint's always been there. It's gone through its own development life cycles. I think there's about 4 different types of developments, right from full trust code to apps or add-ins into what is known now as SharePoint framework. So that's going off. But at the same time, you can build applications, and obviously I won't go through in the entirety of that, but the capabilities have been there at the heart of it with SharePoint. For mainly on-premises side of things, back in 2012 or just before 2012, you had the Business Productivity Online suite with SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, which then got moved into Office 365. And then from since 2012 up to now, as some of us we know, it's just literally booming with lots of capabilities and features, making it more modern. And what this sort of means in a nutshell for me is that when it comes to Teams, then it's finally all about a user, not about the technology, the platforms and all these things. And that's all great, and that's still here. But I feel definitely from a Teams perspective that as a user, they don't need to worry about where their files are or where the conversations are, but it's all about me as to who I need to work with and where do I find my files. So briefly, just around the SharePoint side, I think the information architecture. So some of us we know it's all about SharePoint sites. Essentially, there are 2 types of sites in this modern SharePoint Online experience perspective, which are all interconnected with Office 365 groups, as well as Yammer connected groups. And we'll cover just briefly the groups in a minute. But 2 types of sites: communication sites, which is broadly catered for the wide audiences to create beautiful pages, news, headlines, news pages, as well as some of the other capabilities around that. The main one being team sites, which not only you have your own team departmental collaboration sites, but also you can build custom sites, and that's where much of the development goes on, where bespoke applications are built on, and then being able to serve that. Couple those together, when it comes to building this intranets, then obviously you have the hub sites, which you can actually group some of these SharePoint sites into it to make that wider audience perspective as to relate the navigation, the experience around the search into one single hub site, if you like. And that's broadly speaking that SharePoint to some folks is known as just an area to store files, but it's a bit more than that, because it's not only just to manage your document management system, but also it's got the pages as well as other news areas and lists as well that you can build from, and then you can have Power Apps, Flow, all those things links to it. And then above all, it gets surfaced into OneDrive as well as Teams, and then other areas of Office 365 apps and services as well. So as a SharePoint service that goes, it doesn't matter where you are in SharePoint, knowing that it's surfaced by Delve and the Office Graph signals, if you like, then that's all pulling all this information together as a seamless sort of experience. And that's kind of in a nutshell around how SharePoint sites tends to be organized. So whether it's projects, whether it's intranet, your organization may vary in terms of how you go about organizing your SharePoint sites. So when you compare that with, say, in Teams with SharePoint, so like we were saying that you got your SharePoint, which has got the news pages, the files stored in a document libraries, which essentially has multiple folders, if you like. So we'll look at that in a minute. And then you've also got your lists, pages, and other types of apps that you can create. And that's all usually working in conjunction with OneDrive and SharePoint. But then when you come into the Microsoft Teams world, then you've got essentially every team has got a set of channels. And in this, in the context of SharePoint, as some of us will know, that they're essentially a folders. So each channel represents a folder, and then therefore each folder resides in a native document library of a SharePoint. And when you got your tabs within the actual teams, then you can actually surface some of those pages. So we'll look at that as well. But at the end of the day, from a user point of view, depending on what services they use, whether it's a SharePoint site or a Teams, it doesn't really matter, because it's really just about bringing all those things together and really just giving a focus to what the user needs to do within the realms of Microsoft Teams. And when I have to explain this to the organizations when I go, and in terms of what's the difference between Teams and SharePoint, and this is probably my sort of nutshell view of it, but they're nothing more than, if you like, glorified folders that has got the features around conversations, connecting to not just apps and meetings, but also the people as well into that. So it's a bit more than that, but under the hood, essentially is just folders. And then we can look at it back from the history point of view. From in Exchange, you had public folders, and then within SharePoint side, you had multiple document libraries. People were using document libraries as a way of folders, and then folders within the document libraries. Whatever it is, you can bring all this into a single channel as a section of that particular team, and then focus all your the motivations around creating the content, the chats, conversations for a project or whatever it is within that channel. And therefore integrating with other areas of the planner as well as data and third-party apps as well to bring all that experience into a single team. So from a SharePoint perspective, for any SharePoint administrators out there, some organizations still hold back from rolling out teams. And that's partly because either there's a full lack of understanding in terms of how Teams actually fits in with SharePoint, but also the fact that Teams is constantly evolving with lots of new features and some of the experiences that you have within SharePoint, you still can't quite see within the actual Teams itself. So then there is that bit of a disconnect as to exactly how SharePoint elements work within the Teams. But nevertheless, I think it's getting there, it's getting fast, and so we just have to watch for that. But for now, from a design point of view, within Teams, there's always a question as to when you know, to create a team is fairly straightforward. Don't really need IT for that. Create a team, create yourself channels, and off you go. But fundamentally, from a design perspective, when you look at the architecture perspective, who decides what kind of teams should be deployed? And we look at the governance bit a bit later on, but the question has to be asked. It is a user-based system. It is user-generated content. So really, it's the users who creates the team. But I've come across some organizations where they try to put the control, just like in SharePoint, where the users can't create sites freely, other than when you put a team request or a site request form where they fill out few details about what's the name of the site they want or the description of it, and then the tooling will create the relevant SharePoint site or a Microsoft Teams, or in some cases IT will create it. And so to an extent, from an innovation perspective, in my view, I think that's a bit of a blocker. So all the efforts usually lies around how to control it, where in actual fact, I think the control should be the other way around, i.e. you let the users create. For sure, there'll be a sprawl of sites and teams, as long as the focus is on the effort of getting back to the user and asking, so I see you've created the teams or even a SharePoint site, and you kind of ask them, you know, how is it going? What's it for? But obviously you do need some structure around that to be able to monitor for the life of that particular teams. So there's two ways of looking at it, but either way, it is an organic evolution of it. So you can organize your Microsoft Teams by, say, departments, or you can organize them by projects. So one project equals one team, or you may have a function that's spread across globally in different locations. So you can have maybe a team for that particular function. You know, let's say, for example, like business development, or you may have topical topics, you know, I don't know, something like a football club or something like that for your company, or even customers. You may work with customers, so each customer may have a Microsoft Teams for it, and then all the projects that you deliver for that customer resides as single, as channels for that particular customer team, Microsoft team. And then last, it's more around, you know, it's not just expiry date, but everything happens for a reason. What's the life of it? I mean, I've come across an organization where they've got about 20,000 teams. When asked the question as to how do you manage that, they let the users manage that completely. So as a newbie, when I go to this organization, then obviously I can't see who owns the team. So just looking at my teams, sorry. Got a notification here saying your presentation ended. Someone else has started sharing. Let's have a look what's going on. Can you see my slide? Anyone? Just yes or no, please.
Don't see it yet.
No, okay.
Now you're back.
Okay. Oh, brilliant. Okay. I think somebody started sharing, so it ended my sharing session. So apologies for that. So yeah, I was just saying, so it's important to realize how long the teams is going there for, whether 6 months, 12 months, or 2 years. My definition of when calling teams, because it is a bit of a technical jargon, because you have on one hand SharePoint site, you got Microsoft Teams, then some people refer to Microsoft Teams team, Microsoft defines it as a chat workspace. I like to call it collaboration workspace in a simple, because it is about collaboration, whether it's file-based or Teams, doesn't matter. But from a service perspective, it's easier to define. And then depending on what the underlying components are needed, whether it's the Teams or the Yammer or whichever, makes it easier for users to understand. And then the champions part is important, because whoever decides, and I think there's a huge resource out there on the docs.microsoft.com regarding the adoption side of things. And essentially champions are the ones who are accountable, responsible to facilitate between the business users as well as the project teams and the management around it, to try and hold this together as a collaboration bubble within the organization as to what business scenarios there are that deserves a team, and the ongoing adoption around that. So for some of the demos, I've got just some videos, so hopefully you can see that. So essentially, files tab that you see, which you get with every channel, essentially those files live in SharePoint. And that's not stating the obvious, but I had one customer who were moved away from SharePoint onto another document management system, and only to realize that they want to roll out Teams, to find out that Teams stores files in SharePoint. Now, that can create a lot of confusion, because users will say, we've just moved from SharePoint to another system, and now we're using Teams, so it's going to put our content into files within the Teams, which points to SharePoint. So that's all very well, but from a organization point of view, you now then end up having two systems. But if we just forget that as one of the items that I've sort of seen, but essentially you bring your files, and this is slightly newer experience, so that's kind of coming soon. So the full SharePoint document library that you see in your normal SharePoint site will surface into these particular teams. At the moment, we will see just a list of files from a particular document library. Then you got things like planners. If I just go back to, I'll jump to the demo so I can quickly show you. So if I go to my Microsoft Teams, which is a demo environment that I've got here, and so within this particular team, I can mark a project team, click on my general channel, click on the plus tab to add a tab, and I can pick either a SharePoint, which will give me more options, or I can pick a specific document library. It gives me a relevant sites that I might be interested in. So I can pick a product team, click next, and because I've got another library, so documents as a document library exists in every site, but I've got an additional library called equipment images. So I can select that, click next, give a friendly name, and just call that image, if I can spell it, images, and save. So then straightforwardly, it just brings my images that I have. Now, one might argue, is document library the right place to put images? Yes or no? In this case, you got it, that's fine. It is still a file store, but you get the idea that within the extra tab, I can bring my additional libraries within this Teams tab here. If I open that same tab in SharePoint, I obviously get far more controls and features that I can do within the SharePoint site. So this is a SharePoint site, a particular document library called images. I've got my menu structure on the left, and then I've got my command ribbon, and I can do a lot more depending on if I select a particular file, then this commands change, as well as in all those things. But you can see that I've got an extra column here called category, and those category columns here does not come within this view here. So that's going to change obviously in the coming days or weeks, if you like. So soon then you'll be able to change the view within this particular library as well. So views are just another way of slicing and dicing your library of files into the format that you want, so that they can show up. If I go into planner is another area which I mentioned that you can surface a plan. So if I click on that, then yes, planner, and you get a choice of either bringing your existing plan, or you can create a new plan. So you can have multiple plans if you like that's associated with this particular team as well. So I can just pick on the existing plan, market project plan, save, and there it is. So from a SharePoint perspective, when the SharePoint folks will probably come across planner and all these other elements, and not everything has to be coming within the teams. You can go to tasks.microsoft.com and go and access your planner that way, all within from your app launcher, and that's okay. But it just means that from a team's perspective, as far as SharePoint people are concerned, that it can bring all in one place. So, when it comes to think about the experience, what a typical team should look like, then these are the areas that they can be considered. So if you templatize a Microsoft Teams to say that if we're going to create a new project and we use a template, say Microsoft Teams project for that customer, you can have these plans and everything else templatized as a channel with some bespoke development if needed to have other tabs you want to include. Okay, and then you've got the list elements of it as well. So again, SharePoint list, it's not just files, but you also have lists where you can store your information around stores, budgets, retails, whatever the list it is, just like an Excel. And then that can come through within the actual Teams itself. So it's almost like another lightweight list application they can have within the actual Teams channel. So before you know it, it doesn't really matter where you work, whether it's in SharePoint or Teams. And I know there are a lot of articles out there that advises what to use when. I think in my view, it's whatever works for you, as long as you're productive around getting things done. So, it's really entirely up to you, but at least you can see that whatever the experience you see here can be also worked upon within SharePoint as well. Okay, so planner, we just did the planner. Okay, so another hood, as I mentioned earlier, that for every SharePoint site you create that is connected to Office 365 group, which is essentially a membership service. So, that's the foundation, if you like, that serves other areas of Office 365 and apps and services. But essentially what you get in there is that your general channel is a folder. If you create additional channels, then there are each of the folders within that. So in the SharePoint world, all that looks like, as we know, is just the folders. So if I go back to my SharePoint site here and click on documents, then for that product team there, you can see I've got those folders as way of channels. So general is there as a channel folder and so on. But if I'm in the SharePoint world and if I don't want to mix everything within this area of document library, I can still go ahead and create a new document library as well by going to Home, clicking on New, and click on New Document Library. And let's say we call that Teams Fest, for example. Create that document library. And now if I go back to my site contents, then I can see my documents library is there as well. My equipment images was there as we saw earlier, and I've got my Teams Fest as well. So SharePoint is still rich in its terms of, taking advantage of the content services, the ECM side of things. So if you want to manage your documents more than just Teams, but as far as Teams is concerned, and in my view, I do still think from a files perspective, it is a bit of chaos that you put every single channel's files into folders in a single document library. I think the information architects will have a different view around that because there's no kind of real management. But as far as collaboration is concerned, it's files. Does it matter that it needs to be categorized, classified? Different views for different people on that. And then for OneDrive for Business, so any private chats you have and the files you share between one-to-ones, then those files stays in the folders within your OneDrive for Business. OneDrive is obviously as a separate app, everything else, but under the hood is still part of SharePoint. It's just a special site collection for each and every individual that you have who has OneDrive. So they're just SharePoint site collections under the hood. So it's all part of the SharePoint ecosystem for that. So Microsoft Teams. So this is from Microsoft website. Kind of really explains it in a nicer way because Teams is able to connect to lots of other apps and services, SharePoint and everything else. So this kind of gives you an idea, for at least from a SharePoint architecture perspective, that whilst you got files in Teams, it lives in two different places: OneDrive for Business as well as for SharePoint. But then you've also got areas like the planner and messages, which some of it lives in Exchange group mailboxes. Then you got your stream videos, so any meetings that happen within Teams, the recordings stay within the actual Microsoft stream. And then you got your Yammer connected, the Office 365 connected Yammer groups, which also stays within the Yammer as well as SharePoint site. And this kind of gives you a full breadth of what Teams is around. Obviously, so far, my session is only focusing on the files element for the collaboration. As we know, Teams is a bit more than that: chats, meetings, calls, and there are sessions throughout the day that covers some of the other functionality of Microsoft Teams. But in terms of the rollout perspective, when organizations say they want to establish a collaboration capability, then for me, this is a key area to understand what lies where, so that the relevant security compliance elements of it can be considered carefully instead of just rolling out Microsoft Teams and then start using it. Teams and channel, I've kept it very simple for this. This is not just the area to manage the entire Teams. So there is a Teams admin center, which obviously moved all the settings from the Skype for Business. And as you might know, we are aware of that, Skype for Business is only here for just now less than 2 years, and then it's retiring. So Microsoft Teams is here to stay. And there are settings at the Teams level, at the Teams admin level, which then covers some of the team settings. But from a user perspective, when they're creating their team, then these are the settings that they get. And I'll pick the key ones there. So things like if you go member permissions for people to create or update channels. So that's like our folders within those. So that's something that you can, as a team owner, can control whether any member of the team should be able to add the channels or even add or remove third-party apps, which connects to the vast ecosystem out there. And so you got all those granular settings in there that you can control on a team-by-team basis. There are obviously other areas of the teams which you may not want the users to control. So things like the naming convention of it, or because if they create random names, so then there are other areas for that. From an IT perspective to control that, which is through the Office 365 groups policies area. So governance, it's always talked about: SharePoint governance, Microsoft Teams governance, Office 365 governance, and depending on the size of the organization, you may have different teams who controls this. I think this particular area, which I got from Melissa Hub, kind of depicts it in a nicer way as to the sort of things to consider around how Microsoft Teams should be governed, or at least what should be looked at. So not just about who creates the Microsoft Teams, but also in terms of how long it stays, the guest and external sharing. I've done some extensive demos and presentations around external sharing, so feel free to take a look at that on my slide share. You've got obviously other Microsoft Teams policies areas as well, so messaging features, scheduling, and all those things. So this hopefully gives you an idea in a way that it's not to say that this is from day one to implement governance all this, but it's just kind of designing that journey around what should be there for day one when Microsoft Teams is rolled out versus what should be in, say, 30 or 60 days. Some organizations, small organizations, they have a very small IT team. Sometimes they don't even have a security officer or anybody like that, and the pain is left for the IT team to try and manage the entire Microsoft Teams area. So docs.microsoft.com have got all the detail by detail, steps by steps as to how you can configure some of the elements of these governance areas of that. So hopefully that gives you an idea. Ultimate question is, where does my Teams data live? So because there's various elements of Microsoft Teams, so this kind of slide hopefully gives you an idea where every one of those elements live. Typically, obviously, as we know, files live in SharePoint, OneDrive. The images are on the media service on Azure. Obviously, from a user perspective, you don't really care where this is stored as long as you can access it. But it is worth understanding that if you've got Exchange admins who tend to inherit the ownership for managing Teams, and then SharePoint folks, administrators, might not be even part of this area, obviously that gap is getting a lot closer, where both needs to work together to understand collaboration is across the workloads. But in some cases, you have the organization who have one person trying to manage everything, Exchange, SharePoint, as well as the Microsoft Teams elements from it. From a compliance perspective, this kind of gives you an idea what's covered, what's not covered in terms of outbound. Obviously, anything to do with third-party file cloud storage that you get within Teams, Dropbox or Box and all those areas, then at least that's not managed within Microsoft Teams area. But if your organization files are residing on those third-party storage, then that's something to be mindful of around that. Obviously, if you connect to any connectors such as say Twitter or RSS feeds and all those things, that data is obviously posted to the channel. The actual data, that's underlying data, is coming from somewhere else. So that's from a data residency perspective, something to be aware of. Where does that data lie and what's being surfaced within Microsoft Teams itself. Haven't really covered the bots in particular or any of the custom applications, but depending on what that is, and whilst there are connectors and the whole development framework around it, clearly, obviously, if that's coming from another database or another cloud service, then all that data resides elsewhere, but still being able to surface within Microsoft Teams here as well. In terms of accessing Microsoft Teams, some organizations do have policies around this, and there are some good sessions out there, as well as some good recommendations from Microsoft as well in terms of what should be implemented for, let's say, first 30 days versus in the first 90 days. And it just really amazes me sometimes when I come across some organizations where they've actually even rolled out and MFA is vastly enabled, but nevertheless, it's still one form of authentication, and that does not equal that your environment is secure, because when you start going into the actual detail, the granular levels of it in terms of, can any device connect? So when the management, let's say the drive is that anyone should be able to connect to their files and Teams from anywhere on any device, my question is always around that. Any device means home device included, as well versus corporate device. And this is an area which does require quite a lot of thinking around it, because is it going to be all Teams or is it going to be a select Teams? What devices you're going to protect, what locations and all those. So this gives you kind of, each of these areas has its own sessions, to be honest, but at least gives you some pointers around where to get the info that you need to try and implement what devices actually control and access your content within your Office 365, not just Teams, but also other areas of the services as well. Conditional access goes hand in hand, in particular with the DLP, the data leakage prevention. So if you got any confidential information or any confidential sites, so one of the things you can do through Office 365 groups is the ability to classify what that group, eventually the Microsoft team, with that, if it's confidential or just general use, then you can actually design your conditions around who can access, who can do what. So whether they can download a document, whether they can access the rich client interface for the Teams as well as SharePoint, or can they just access it via a browser, for example. So you can do all those controls, everything and in between, in terms of whether to block it or even grant access around that. So conditional access is quite a key part, as well as being able to control as to which workloads they can do, whether it's SharePoint, Exchange, or OneDrive, or whichever it is on that. Finally, around monitoring an aspect of it, obviously auditing is not exactly monitoring, but in terms of you got your monitoring dashboards around, to see the insight into, what the charts, the number of files you have in the environment. But in addition to that is the auditing and reporting. And I always get this all the time, that if I go into the audit log within Security and Compliance Center, then why don't I see what files that are within the teams? And that's only because, like we mentioned earlier, that SharePoint has its own section of managing the auditing activities. And there you can see what files are modified, shared, the entire range for the files area. But these are roughly the Microsoft Teams activities in terms of what you can actually audit, and just around to see any activities you want to view for the Microsoft Teams. Obviously, the default is 90 days. For the last 90 days, you will see. If you want to see more than that, and I think it's not generally available yet, but with the depending on which license you've got, you should be able to see like up to 1 year's worth of audit data on that when that's generally available on that. So that's basically my session, and I do understand it was a fairly fast-paced session. There's a lot of info in those slides, but the idea was that it's, although Microsoft Teams is for the user, but also it's just mainly from an IT point of view, how best to manage it and consider it and securely govern, if you like, your collaboration spaces that you'll get within that. So with that note, thank you for taking the time to tune into this session, and I've reserved specifically some more time for question and answers on this so that you can actually get through with this quickly. But there's the link over there, good, bad, whatever it is, I don't mind. There's the link. So if you don't mind just filling out the feedback, that would be great. And I'm always on, my blog is very little used, but Twitter is quite good. I share a lot of articles, links from Microsoft, and that's one of my ways to keep up with the learning as well. So with that, thanks very much, and I'll take questions.